They say one never notices the moment of transformation. The line between what you were and what you have become blurs like blood in water. I remember when my hands were still human. I was once Kael Vor, planetary governor of Marinus 4, a world of reasonable prosperity and unremarkable loyalty. The administratum reports had always marked us as compliant. Our tithes were paid with minimal delay. Our recruitment quotas were met without complaint. Generations of my family had governed with quiet competence. None among us had ever sought glory. We simply existed in service to the Golden Throne, as countless billions do across the stars. None would have predicted my fall. I certainly did not. The first corruption is so subtle that you welcome it as clarity. It began during the Festival of Compliance, a drab ceremonial week where we celebrated 5 centuries of unbroken imperial rule. The skies were overcast that season, endless clouds of grey that seemed to press down upon the spires of our modest hive city. I stood upon the balcony of the gubernatorial palace, looking out at the masses gathered below, their faces turned upward in mindless devotion. The sight should have filled me with pride. Instead, I felt nothing but contempt. How many generations had we spent in servitude to a corpse god who offered nothing in return? How many of our sons and daughters had been fed into the meat grinder of imperial wars, fought on distant worlds for reasons none could articulate? The questions came unbidden, thoughts I had never before allowed myself to entertain, yet there they were, sudden and insistent, like a wound that had always existed beneath my skin but only now began to bleed. That night I could not sleep. My mind raced with possibilities I had never considered. Visions of a different world, a different future, plagued me. In the darkness of my chambers, I heard a voice, soft at first, barely distinguishable from my own thoughts. It spoke of potential, of power waiting to be claimed, of freedom from the crushing weight of imperial rule. I told no one of these thoughts. In the following days, I performed my duties as expected. I reviewed production reports, authorized resource allocations, and presided over minor legal disputes. But beneath the surface, something had changed. I began to see the flaws in the system I had served for so long. The inefficiency, the waste, the cruelty masquerading as necessity. The voice grew stronger. It spoke of ancient powers that existed before the Imperium, before the Emperor, gods who rewarded ambition rather than blind obedience, gods who saw potential in men like me. I did not immediately succumb. For months I resisted, clinging to the beliefs that had defined my life. I increased my attendance at imperial services. I commissioned a new statue of the Emperor for the central plaza. I ordered public executions of suspected heretics, watching their bodies burn with an intensity that disturbed even my most zealous advisors. But resistance only made the voice stronger. It began to show me things, visions that came when I closed my eyes. I saw myself leading armies across the stars. I saw my name spoken with reverence and fear. I saw power beyond anything the Imperium could offer. The change was gradual enough that I could pretend it was not happening. Small compromises, minor indulgences. A blind eye turned to certain activities within my domain. Private investigations into ancient texts that should have been destroyed. Secret communications with individuals whose names never appeared in official records. The first physical manifestation of my corruption appeared on the night of the winter solstice. I awoke from troubled dreams to find a small mark upon my chest, directly above my heart. A simple spiral, no larger than a coin, that seemed to have been burned into my flesh. Yet there was no pain, no inflammation. It looked as though it had always been there, a natural part of me finally revealing itself. I should have been horrified. I should have reported myself to the ecclesiarchy immediately. Instead, I felt a surge of pride. The mark was confirmation that I had been chosen, that I was special, that my destiny extended beyond the limited horizons of imperial service. The voice had a name now. It called itself Exophan, an emissary of the changer of ways. It promised knowledge and power in exchange for service. Not blind obedience, but partnership. a covenant between beings of mutual ambition. My fall accelerated after that night. I began to make subtle changes to the governance of Marinus 4th. Resources were diverted from Imperial projects to initiatives of my own design. Certain industries were prioritized over others. Specific individuals were elevated to positions of influence, people who shared my growing dissatisfaction with Imperial rule. None recognized these changes for what they were. The bureaucracy of the Imperium is so vast, so labyrinthine, that adjustments can be hidden within the endless flow of data and documentation. By the time anyone might have noticed, it would be too late. The mark above my heart grew slowly, the spiral extending tendrils across my chest like roots seeking soil. Other changes followed. My dreams became more vivid, filled with symbols and geometries that should not exist in three-dimensional space. I found myself understanding concepts that had previously seemed impenetrable. The underlying patterns of reality began to reveal themselves to me, like a complex mechanism suddenly rendered transparent. My first true act of heresy came almost a year after the initial corruption. A delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus had arrived to conduct a standard assessment of our industrial capacity. Among them was a tech priest named Magos Dreniv, a spindly figure more machine than man, whose augmetic eyes seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed facade of my continued loyalty. During a private audience, he confronted me directly. "Your data submissions contain anomalies, Governor Vor," he said, his voice a metallic rasp. "Production variances that cannot be explained by standard deviation parameters. Resource allocations that contradict optimal efficiency matrices." In that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could retreat, manufacture explanations, and delay the inevitable discovery of my activities. Or I could take the first irreversible step down the path that had been revealed to me. I chose the latter. What happened in that room is something I have never spoken of to anyone. The memories are fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror. I remember Zafan's voice, stronger than ever, guiding my words and actions. I remember symbols appearing in the air between myself and the Magos, glowing sigils that burned themselves into reality. I remember the tech priest's augmetic eyes widening in recognition, then fear, then something like rapture. When the audience concluded, Magos Dreniv left my chambers a changed being. The delegation departed 2 days later, their assessment complete. Their report to Mars would contain no mention of anomalies or irregularities. Instead, it would praise the exceptional efficiency and productivity of Marinus 4, recommending our methodologies be studied and perhaps implemented elsewhere. I had my first ally in what would become my inner circle. Over the following months, others would join. Some were corrupted as Dreniv had been. Others came willingly, drawn by ambition or dissatisfaction or simple curiosity. A network formed beneath the surface of imperial governance, a shadow hierarchy devoted to the changer of ways. The mark continued to spread across my body, spirals and halls of discolored flesh that I concealed beneath increasingly elaborate gubernatorial robes. My dreams were now dominated by visions of a vast library where every possible future was catalogued and accessible to those with the knowledge to navigate its impossible architecture. Sometimes I would awake to find that I had filled pages with writings in languages I had never studied, complex theorems that redefined the fundamental nature of reality. As my power grew, so too did my caution. I knew the consequences of discovery. The Imperium does not forgive heresy, especially among those entrusted with authority. Detection would mean not just my death, but the death of millions as punishment for allowing corruption to take root. Entire hive blocks would be purged, perhaps the entire planet would be cleansed with fire. The irony did not escape me. The very system I was betraying had instilled in me the discipline and attention to detail that now protected my betrayal. The skills that had made me an effective servant of the Imperium now made me an effective agent of its enemies. 2 years passed. My transformation continued, both physical and mental. The changes to my body could no longer be completely hidden. I began to withdraw from public appearances, citing health concerns. My communications were increasingly conducted through intermediaries. Rumors spread among the population. Some said I was dying, others claimed I had already died and been replaced by a double. None suspected the truth. In private, I reveled in my metamorphosis. The spiral patterns had spread to cover most of my torso and were beginning to extend down my arms and legs. My eyes had changed, the irises shifting from brown to a luminous amber that seemed to contain infinite depth. My mental capabilities had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined in my former life. I could perceive patterns in the flow of time itself, glimpsing potential futures and selecting the paths most advantageous to my designs. Zafan was no longer a voice separate from my own thoughts. We had become something closer to a single entity. The distinction between his will and mine had blurred, just as the line between my human form and something other had begun to fade. It was during this period that I first heard whispers of the Ordo Hereticus. Nothing concrete, nothing that would indicate direct investigation, but enough to create concern. Agents of the Inquisition had been observed in neighboring systems, conducting what were described as routine evaluations. But there is no such thing as a routine evaluation when it comes to the Inquisition. I accelerated my plans. The network I had built now extended beyond Marinus 4, reaching into adjacent systems through trade agreements, diplomatic channels, and carefully cultivated personal relationships. Cells of devotees waited for my signal, prepared to take action when the moment arrived. That moment came sooner than expected. A strike cruiser of the Imperial Navy entered orbit without warning or explanation. Standard protocol required immediate communication and clarification of purpose. None was forthcoming. Instead, 3 Thunderhawk gunships detached from the cruiser and began descent toward the capital. I knew then that we had been discovered, or at least suspected. There would be no more time for subtle manipulation. The conflict would now be open and direct. What followed was the first Battle of Marinus, though Imperial records would later deny it ever occurred. The forces at my disposal were initially modest, consisting primarily of the Planetary Defense Force supplemented by certain elements of the local Adeptus Mechanicus who had joined my cause. Against us stood a company of Imperial Fists Space Marines, among the most formidable warriors in the Imperium. By all rational assessment, we should have been annihilated within hours. The Space Marines were not only superior in terms of combat capability, but also operated with absolute moral certainty. They were the Emperor's finest, genetically engineered for warfare and indoctrinated to know no fear. Yet we prevailed. Not through conventional military strategy, but through means that defied conventional understanding. As the Imperial forces advanced through the capital, reality itself seemed to warp around them. Buildings that had stood for centuries suddenly contained corridors that looped back on themselves or led to chambers that should not have existed. Communications failed in patterns that could not be explained by standard interference. Sensorium readings showed multiple versions of the same targets appearing simultaneously in different locations. I directed these effects from the depths of the gubernatorial palace, drawing upon powers that even I did not fully comprehend. The mark upon my body burned with cold fire as I shaped the underlying fabric of our reality, guided by Xaphan's knowledge and my own burgeoning abilities. The Space Marines fought with characteristic determination and discipline. They adapted to the impossible geometries and chronological anomalies as best they could. They maintained unit cohesion even as the very concept of spatial relationships became increasingly malleable. They pressed forward toward their objective, suffering losses but never wavering. In the end, it was not victory in the traditional sense that we achieved, but rather a stalemate that served our purposes. After 3 days of impossible conflict, the Imperial forces withdrew to orbit. The strike cruiser departed the system shortly thereafter, presumably to report what they had encountered and request reinforcements. I knew we had gained only a temporary reprieve. The Imperium would return in greater numbers, with specific countermeasures for the phenomena they had witnessed. We needed to be gone before that happened. The evacuation began immediately. Not a panicked exodus, but a carefully orchestrated migration. Selected individuals and resources were prioritized. The rest would be left behind, both to maintain the appearance of normalcy and to serve as a distraction when the hammer of imperial retribution eventually fell. My inner circle and I departed Marinus 4 aboard a modified bulk freighter whose cargo holds had been converted to accommodate our specific needs. Magos Dreniv had overseen the modifications personally, incorporating technologies that would have earned him immediate execution had they been discovered by his former colleagues in the Mechanicus. As we broke orbit, I stood in the observation dome, watching as the world of my birth receded into the distance. The spiral patterns on my skin pulsed with energy, synchronizing with the rhythm of the warp drives as they prepared to tear a hole in reality and propel us into the Imperium. I felt nothing resembling regret or nostalgia. Those emotions belonged to Kael Vor, planetary governor of Marinus IV. That man no longer existed. In his place stood someone, something else. A being in transition, a vessel for powers beyond mortal comprehension. As the warp engines engaged and reality distorted around our vessel, I embraced the next phase of my transformation. The Imperium had taught me discipline, administration, and the management of power. Now those skills would serve a different master, a god of change and possibility whose designs transcended the limited imagination of the Corpse Emperor. Our destination lay in the region known as the Halo Stars, a mysterious and largely uncharted area at the fringe of the galaxy. There, beyond the reach of Imperial authority, we would establish a new power base. From there, my influence would spread back toward the heart of the Imperium, subtle and patient, like the spiral patterns that had come to define my existence. The journey through the warp was unlike any standard transit. Where most Imperial vessels require Geller fields to create a bubble of real space, protecting them from the horrors of the Imperium, our ship embraced those same energies. We traveled not in defiance of the warp, but in harmony with it. The effects were both terrifying and exhilarating. Time lost all meaning. Moments stretched into what felt like centuries, then compressed back into the roundest microseconds. The boundaries between individual consciousness began to blur. Thoughts became visible, manifesting as colorful patterns that drifted through the corridors of the ship. Dreams escaped from sleeping minds to intermingle with waking reality. Throughout this impossible journey, I continued to change. The spiral patterns completed their coverage of my body, my skin now an intricate canvas of halls and curves that seemed to move subtly when not directly observed. My voice acquired harmonic overtones that could not be produced by a human larynx. Most significantly, my perception expanded beyond the limitations of physical senses. I began to see the ship not merely as a vessel of metal and energy, but as a node within the greater pattern of the universe. I could trace the connections between our current position and all potential destinations. I could perceive the gossamer threads of causality that bound past to present to future. This expanded awareness came with a price. The more I perceived, the less human I became. Memories of my former life began to fade or transform. Did I truly remember the face of my father, or was the image in my mind a construction based on what a father should look like? Had I ever actually walked the gardens of the gubernatorial palace, or were those recollections implanted to create the illusion of a consistent past? Identity itself became fluid, a construct to be shaped rather than an immutable foundation. I was Kael Vor, but I was also becoming something else, something without name or precedent. The boundaries that separated me from Zafan, from the warp itself, grew increasingly permeable. Our arrival in the Halo Stars marked the beginning of the next phase. The system we chose had no official designation in Imperial records, merely a numerical classification in ancient navigational charts. The primary planet was technically habitable, though no human colony had ever been established there. The surface was predominantly covered by a shallow ocean of heavy metals in liquid form, with islands of crystalline formations that reached toward a sky perpetually veiled in aurora-like phenomena. It was perfect for our purposes. The unusual electromagnetic properties of the environment would mask our presence from standard Imperial scanning. The liquid metal oceans could be harvested for raw materials. The isolation would give us time to build and prepare. We established our first settlement on the largest of the crystalline islands, creating structures that melded technology with organic forms in ways that would have horrified orthodox members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Magos Dreniv oversaw the construction, his own form now as altered as my own. Mechadendrites that had once been purely functional appendages had transformed into sinuous tentacles that constantly rearranged themselves into complex mathematical expressions. His augmetic eyes had multiplied, covering his head in a crown of lenses that each perceived a different spectrum of reality. As our new domain took shape, others began to arrive. Word of our enclave spread through channels invisible to imperial authorities, but well known to those who sought alternatives to the crushing orthodoxy of the throne. Renegade tech priests brought knowledge and rare technologies. Disillusioned imperial officers brought military expertise and occasionally entire crews or units who had turned from their oaths. Scholars and psychers who had glimpsed the truth behind the imperial creed came seeking confirmation and community. Not all were welcomed. I had learned the value of selectivity during my time as governor. Quality mattered more than quantity. Each potential addition to our growing society was evaluated not merely for their immediate utility, but for their alignment with the broader pattern we sought to create. Some came seeking only power or refuge from imperial justice. These were useful in their way, but kept at the periphery of our organization. Others came with genuine devotion to the changer of ways, having independently discovered the truths that had been revealed to me. These became our inner cadre, entrusted with knowledge and authority proportionate to their understanding. 5 years passed according to standard imperial chronology. Though subjective time within our enclave flowed differently, our numbers grew to several thousand. Our technological capabilities expanded beyond anything available to all but the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Our understanding of the warp and its relationship to real space deepened through constant study and experimentation. Throughout this period of growth, my transformation continued. The final vestiges of my human appearance fell away. My height increased until I towered over even the augmented forms of our tech priests. My flesh became something other than flesh, a substance that maintained consistent form only through conscious effort. My voice could now alter the thoughts of those who heard it, planting suggestions that took root and flourished in the fertile soil of receptive minds. Yet these physical changes were merely the visible manifestation of a more profound metamorphosis. My consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of linear time. I could perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously, evaluating probabilities and adjusting our course to maximize desirable outcomes. I could reach into the minds of our followers across vast distances, guiding and instructing without the need for conventional communication. With these abilities came new challenges. The more my perception expanded, the more difficult it became to focus on any single point in time or space. The endless branching of potential futures created a labyrinth of possibility in which I sometimes lost myself for subjective weeks, only to return to find that mere moments had passed in real space. Zafan's presence within me evolved as well. No longer a distinct voice or personality, he had become more like a current of power that flowed through the expanding ocean of my consciousness. At times I was aware of his guidance, particularly when interfacing with the deeper mysteries of the warp. At other times, the distinction between his will and mine disappeared entirely. As my power grew, so too did my awareness of other powers that moved within the Imperium. The changer of ways was but one of the great entities that humans, in their limited understanding, referred to as the Chaos Gods. I sensed the presence of the others, the Blood God, the Lord of Decay, and the Prince of Excess. Each represented a fundamental aspect of existence, a primal force that had been shaped by countless millennia of mortal emotions and desires. I remained devoted to Tsench, the architect of fate, but I came to understand that true mastery required acknowledgement of all four powers and the complex interplay between them. Balance, not exclusivity, would be the foundation of our new paradigm. This understanding informed the structure of the society we created. While the worship of Tsench remained predominant, We established sanctuaries for adherents of the other powers, controlled environments where their particular energies could be channeled and directed rather than allowed to run rampant. This approach was not without controversy. Many among our inner circle, particularly those who had come to us already devoted to the changer of ways, viewed this inclusivity as dangerous heresy. The four powers were rivals, they argued, competing for dominance rather than components of a unified whole. I allowed these debates to continue, even encouraged them. Intellectual conflict generated energy that could be harnessed. Competing viewpoints created a dynamism that prevented stagnation. The resulting tension was not a flaw in our design but an essential component of its function. As our enclave matured, we began to extend our influence beyond our initial system. Scout vessels ventured into neighboring regions, establishing communication with other renegade groups and evaluating potential targets for expansion. We avoided direct confrontation with Imperial forces, preferring to operate in the shadows of their awareness. This period of growth and consolidation came to an abrupt end with the arrival of a small fleet at the edge of our system. Not Imperial vessels, but ships of distinctive design, bearing markings associated with one of the great traitor legions, the Thousand Sons. Their leader identified himself as Sorcerer Lord Akhenaten, a being whose existence predated the Horus heresy itself. His physical form was a masterpiece of transfiguration, a perfect fusion of armor, flesh, and warp energy that radiated power visible even to non-psychic observers. He came not as a conqueror but as an emissary, bearing an invitation from his master, a being known throughout the galaxy as Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons and ascended Daemon Prince of Tziench. The invitation was simple in content but profound in implication. Our enclave had drawn the attention of powers far greater than ourselves. Our work was deemed promising, worthy of further investment and development. We were offered a place within the broader tapestry of the long war against the false emperor. The offer was not presented as a choice. In the complex hierarchy of the forces opposed to the Imperium, we were but newcomers, regardless of the power I had personally attained. To refuse would be to invite destruction. I accepted the terms presented by Akhenaten, integrating our forces into the broader coalition commanded by Magnus. In practical terms, this meant contributing resources and personnel to specific operations while maintaining a degree of autonomy in our internal affairs. This new arrangement accelerated my personal transformation. Access to the ancient knowledge preserved by the Thousand Sons opened pathways of development that might otherwise have taken centuries to discover. Rituals and incantations dating back to Old Terra itself, preserved through the millennia by those who had walked with the Primarch during the Great Crusade. The most significant advancement came in the form of direct communion with Tziench himself. No longer mediated through Xaphan or limited by my own still developing perceptions, I experienced the full attention of the Changer of Ways focused upon my being. The experience defies description in any human language. Concepts like consciousness or identity became meaningless in the face of such immensity. I was simultaneously elevated and annihilated, my individual existence both infinitely significant and utterly inconsequential within the vast scheme of the great game. When I returned to what might be termed normal awareness, I was fundamentally altered. My physical form had stabilized into something that bore little resemblance to my original human appearance. 9 feet tall, my body covered in iridescent scales that shifted color with my thoughts. My head elongated and crowned with curved horns that functioned as psychic amplifiers. My eyes, now 4 in number, could perceive not only the visible spectrum but also the flows of warp energy that permeated all existence. More profound than these physical changes was the transformation of my mind. I now possessed knowledge that no mortal was meant to contain. The underlying mathematics of reality itself were laid bare before me. The secret histories of countless civilizations, most long extinct, occupied portions of my memory that had not previously existed. Languages that had never been spoken by human tongues took root in my consciousness, providing frameworks for concepts that could not be expressed in Gothic or any of its derivatives. With this ascension came new responsibilities. I was no longer merely the leader of a renegade enclave, but a champion of Tzeentch, invested with a portion of his power and bound to his service in ways both obvious and subtle. My actions would now directly affect the flow of the great game, the eternal contest between the Chaos Gods for dominance of the warp and, by extension, reality itself. The first test of my new status came in the form of a massive imperial crusade launched into the region of the Halo stars we had claimed as our domain. Led by elements of the Grey Knights chapter and supported by significant inquisitorial assets, the crusade represented a direct existential threat to everything we had built. Under my previous limitations, such a force would have been beyond our capacity to resist. Even with the support of our new allies among the Thousand Suns, conventional military action would have resulted in inevitable defeat. The Grey Knights were specifically created and trained to combat the forces of chaos, particularly those with significant warp presence. But I was no longer bound by conventional limitations. Drawing upon the knowledge and power granted by Tzeentch, I enacted a counter-strategy that operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The first phase involved the creation of what might be termed reality anchors, physical structures placed at mathematically significant locations throughout our territory. These devices, combining technology with sorcery, generated fields that stabilized certain aspects of real space while allowing others to become more fluid. Within these carefully defined parameters, I could exercise far greater control over local conditions without risking the kind of catastrophic warp breach that might attract even larger imperial response. Space and time became malleable, subject to reconfiguration according to precise formulae rather than wild fluctuation. As the Imperial fleet approached, they encountered phenomena that defied their extensive experience and training. Distances expanded or contracted unpredictably. Vox communications arrived before they were sent. Sensor readings showed targets that existed in potential rather than actual states. The Grey Knights, being partially warp entities themselves due to their unique creation, were somewhat resistant to these effects. Their Aegis armor and innate abilities allowed them to maintain cohesion and purpose even as reality itself seemed to conspire against them. This had been anticipated in my calculations. The purpose of the reality distortions was not to defeat the Grey Knights directly, but to separate them from their support elements and channel them towards specific confrontation points where other measures had been prepared. The resulting conflict lasted what appeared to the Imperials to be several months, though subjective time within our altered zones varied considerably. Throughout this period, I coordinated our defense from a central sanctum, my consciousness extended across our entire territory, simultaneously aware of hundreds of individual engagements. The final phase of the conflict centered on a direct confrontation with the Grey Knights' command structure. Their Brotherhood champion, a warrior named Hyperion whose psychic might had earned him the title Bladebreaker, led a strike force directly against our central sanctum, bypassing the distortion fields through methods that demonstrated why the Grey Knights were so feared even among the forces of chaos. The battle between Hyperion and myself represented a clash not merely of individuals but of opposing fundamental principles. His power derived from absolute faith in the Emperor and the rigid discipline of the Grey Knights' training. Mine flowed from Tzeentch, embodying change and possibility. In physical terms, the combat was spectacular. His force weapon, a halberd crackling with psychic energy specifically attuned to banish warp entities, against my staff of office, now transformed into a conduit for sorceries that could rewrite the local laws of physics. The chamber in which we fought changed with each exchange, its architecture responding to the fluctuating energies we unleashed. On the psychic plane, the conflict was even more intense. His mind was a fortress of absolute conviction, each thought reinforced by indoctrination so thorough it had become indistinguishable from his fundamental nature. Against this, I deployed conceptual attacks that did not seek to break his defenses but to introduce elements of uncertainty and possibility into the rigid structure of his thinking. Neither of us achieved total victory. Hyperion succeeded in inflicting a wound that even my transformed physiology could not immediately repair, a psychic lesion that disrupted the connection between my form in real space and the warp energies that sustained it. In return, I shattered his force weapon and implanted in his mind a seed of doubt that would slowly grow beyond the ability of even his formidable mental discipline to contain. The Grey Knights withdrew following this confrontation, not in defeat but in strategic reassessment. They had encountered something beyond their existing protocols, an evolving threat that required new countermeasures. The Crusade would regroup, analyze, and return with refined tactics. This outcome, while not the complete victory that some among our forces had hoped for, aligned perfectly with the designs of Tzeentch. Stagnation is anathema to the changer of ways. The adaptation and evolution that would result from this encounter, on both sides, represented the true victory in his estimation. For me, the aftermath of the conflict brought new understanding of my position within the greater pattern. I was powerful beyond my former comprehension, capable of standing against the most elite warriors the Imperium could field. Yet I was also a servant, bound to the will of an entity whose designs extended across dimensions and millennia. The wound inflicted by Hyperion, while not fatal, proved significant in ways I had not initially recognized. The disruption of my connection to the warp created a kind of psychic scar tissue, a region within my consciousness that remained partially isolated from the flow of warp energy that otherwise permeated my being. Within this sheltered space, something unexpected began to develop. A fragment of my original human identity, preserved like an insect in amber. Memories and perspectives that should have been subsumed in my transformation remained intact, offering a viewpoint distinct from both my ascended consciousness and the influence of Tzeentch. This internal division was initially disturbing, a potential weakness in the unified purpose I had cultivated. Yet as I examined it more closely, I recognized its value. The human perspective provided insights that might otherwise be overlooked by a consciousness too far removed from mortal experience. The capacity for certain types of creative thinking seemed enhanced by the interaction between these different aspects of my being. Rather than seeking to eliminate this remnant of Kael Vor, I cultivated it as one might tend a garden of particular utility, not dominant, not even equal to my ascended self, but present and functional within its defined parameters. This internal evolution coincided with external developments that would shape the next phase of our existence. The alliance with the Thousand Suns, initially a matter of necessity, had proven mutually beneficial. Our unique approach to the manipulation of real space and warp space attracted interest from the highest levels of their hierarchy. Magnus himself, the Crimson King, took note of our methodologies. While direct communication with a being of his stature remained beyond my current capacity, his interest manifested in the form of resources and knowledge made available through Akhenaten and other intermediaries. Our enclave expanded, incorporating additional systems and establishing what might be termed colonies, though the relationship between these outposts and our central authority defied simple, hierarchical description. Each developed according to its own pattern, influenced by local conditions and the specific composition of its leadership. Throughout this period of expansion, I continued my personal evolution. The wound inflicted by Hyperion gradually healed, though the isolated region of consciousness remained. My mastery of both sorcery and technology advanced, the distinction between them becoming increasingly meaningless from my perspective. Most significantly, my relationship with Tzeentch evolved from simple service to something more complex. I began to perceive the multiple, often contradictory agendas that the Changer of Ways pursued simultaneously. The great game between the Chaos Gods operated according to rules that no mortal mind, even one as expanded as my own, could fully comprehend. This awareness brought both power and peril. The more I understood of Tzeentch's design, the more valuable I became as his instrument. Yet that same understanding revealed the fundamental truth that all servants of chaos eventually confront, regardless of their patron. We were tools, not partners. Our ascension was not liberation but a more profound form of bondage. The human fragment within me recoiled from this realization. It retained enough of Kael'vor's original ambition and pride to resent relegation to the status of a pawn, regardless of how exalted that pawn might be within the grand design. My ascended consciousness recognized the irony. I had begun my journey seeking freedom from the crushing orthodoxy of the Imperium, only to bind myself to a different master whose demands, while less predictable, were no less absolute. Yet there was a crucial difference. The Imperium demanded blind obedience to immutable law. Tsianch required constant adaptation to evolving circumstance. One path led to stagnation, the other to endless transformation. Given that choice, I remained committed to the latter, despite its ultimate limitations. This philosophical reconciliation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor to our central enclave. Not an emissary from the Thousand Suns or any other established power within the forces of chaos, but a lone figure who materialized within the heart of our most secure sanctum, bypassing defenses that should have been impenetrable. He appeared as a robed human of unremarkable physical appearance, save for eyes that contained spiral patterns identical to those that had first manifested on my flesh during the initial stages of my transformation. When he spoke, his voice resonated with harmonic overtones that I recognized as characteristic of extensive warp mutation. Kael'vor, he said, using my original name rather than any of the titles I had acquired since my ascension. Your progress has been noted. The next trial approaches. Before I could respond, he gestured with one hand, conjuring an image in the air between us. A world I recognized immediately, though I had not seen it in nearly a decade. Marinus IV, the planet of my birth and the starting point of my journey. The image shifted, showing Imperial forces in orbit. Not a standard garrison or defensive fleet, but a massive assemblage centered around an inquisitorial black ship. Accompanying the image came knowledge, inserted directly into my mind, of what was occurring on the surface. A systematic purge of the population, searching for any trace of the corruption I had initiated before my departure. They believe you may have left sleeper agents, the visitor explained, though I had already intuited as much. The Ordo Hereticus suspects a generational cult. They intend to eliminate the entire planetary population and repopulate from scratch, rather than risk overlooking even a single compromised individual. I felt something unexpected stir within me, not merely in the preserved human fragment of my consciousness, but throughout my entire being. A response that defied easy categorization. Not quite anger, not precisely regret, but a complex emotion that contained elements of both and more besides. This is your next trial, the visitor continued. Your response to this development will determine your future path. Who are you to declare my trials? I asked, my voice resonating with power that would have reduced an ordinary mortal to component atoms. He smiled, unaffected. I am what you may become, should you prove worthy. With that cryptic statement, he vanished, leaving only the image of Marinus IV hanging in the air before me. As I studied it, I realized that the purge had not yet begun in earnest. The inquisitorial forces were still establishing their operational parameters. There was a narrow window of opportunity for intervention. The decision before me was complex. From a purely strategic perspective, Marinus IV held no particular value to our current operations. The population, while technically my former subjects, had no special claim on my protection. Many would have willingly participated in my execution had my heresy been discovered during my time as governor. Yet I found myself unable to simply dismiss the matter. The fragment of Kael'vor within me insisted that these people were my responsibility, that I had set in motion the chain of events that now threatened them with extinction. My ascended consciousness recognized a different dimension to the situation, a test of my understanding of power and its application. I convened my inner circle, now composed of beings as transformed as myself, though each in unique ways. Magos Dreniv had evolved into a creature that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp. His mechanical components merged with warp energy to create a hybrid form that defied conventional categorization. Others had undergone similarly profound transformations, each reflecting their individual paths to enlightenment. I presented the situation without initial comment, allowing each to offer their perspective before revealing my own inclination. The resulting discussion was multifaceted, conducted simultaneously on verbal, psychic, and symbolic levels. Some argued for non-intervention, viewing the destruction of Marinus IV as irrelevant to our greater purpose. Others saw strategic value in opposing the Inquisition, regardless of the specific target of their attention. A few recognized, as I did, the deeper significance of the choice before us. In the end, the decision was mine alone, as the visitor had clearly intended. I chose intervention, but not in the straightforward manner that my human fragment initially proposed. What followed was an operation of unprecedented complexity, drawing upon the full extent of my evolved capabilities and the combined resources of our enclave. Not a direct military confrontation with the inquisitorial forces, which would have resulted in mutual destruction, but something far more subtle. Using technologies developed by our techno-sorcerers, we created what might be described as a dimensional fold, a localized manipulation of real space that established a connection between our current domain and a specific region of Marinus IV. Not a conventional portal or warp gate, but a selective overlay of two distinct locations. Through this connection, we initiated a graduated evacuation of the population, not en masse, which would have immediately alerted the inquisitorial forces, but in carefully calculated patterns designed to mimic natural population decline. Individuals and family units disappeared from their hab blocks, only to reappear in reception centers we had constructed specifically for this purpose. Simultaneously, we implemented a deception protocol to mask these disappearances from inquisitorial scrutiny. Psychic echoes, holographic projections, and temporal distortions combined to create the impression that the targeted individuals remained in their original locations, going about their normal activities. The operation continued for what the inhabitants of Marinus IV experienced as several months, though subjective time within our domain and within the dimensional fold operated according to different parameters. Throughout this period, I maintained constant oversight. My consciousness extended across both locations and the intervening dimensional space. The strain was immense, beyond anything I had previously attempted. The wound inflicted by Hyperion, though healed in physical terms, created a persistent vulnerability that threatened to compromise the entire operation at critical moments. I found myself increasingly dependent on the human fragment of my consciousness, which demonstrated unexpected resilience in maintaining focus under these conditions. As the evacuation neared completion, the inquisitorial forces finally detected anomalies in their surveillance data. Their response was immediate and overwhelming. Suspecting warp sorcery, they initiated a full lockdown of the planetary surface, deploying null fields and psychic suppressors in a grid pattern designed to disrupt any ongoing manipulation. These countermeasures threatened to collapse the dimensional fold prematurely, potentially trapping millions in a state of partial translation between locations. The resulting psychic backlash would have caused incalculable damage to both real space and the warp in the vicinity. To prevent this outcome, I was forced to manifest a direct presence on Marinus IV, physically transferring a portion of my consciousness through the dimensional fold to stabilize the connection from that side. This division of my being into separate but linked instances represented a level of personal risk I had not anticipated when the operation began. The instance of myself that materialized on Marinus IV took a form resembling my original human appearance, though with subtle indicators of my transformed nature visible to those with the perception to recognize them. This was partly practical camouflage and partly an unconscious expression of the human fragment's influence over this particular manifestation. Moving through the capital city that had once been the center of my governance, I experienced a disorienting overlap of past and present. Buildings and landmarks that featured in Kael'vor's memories now viewed through senses that perceived far more than visible light and physical dimension. The psychic residue of countless lives, layered like geological strata, creating a palimpsest of experience that threatened to overwhelm even my expanded consciousness. I made my way to the gubernatorial palace, now serving as the primary command center for the inquisitorial forces. The structure had been modified extensively, its original architecture barely recognizable beneath layers of defensive enhancements and symbolic purification. Statues that had once depicted imperial heroes now bore the distinct iconography of the Ordo Hereticus. Hallways that had once echoed with the mundane business of planetary administration now hummed with the energy of active null fields and psychic wards. At the heart of this transformed space, I located the central null generator, a massive device that served as the cornerstone of the Inquisition's countermeasures. Its design incorporated technologies so secret that even most Inquisitors would not recognize their origin or function. This was the product of the Ordo Hereticus's darkest research, drawing upon xenotech and forbidden science in the name of protecting humanity from the very influences such methods represented. The irony was not lost on me. The Imperium's hypocrisy, its willingness to employ the tools of its enemies while maintaining a facade of absolute purity, had been among the first catalysts of my own turn from imperial service. Seeing it manifested so blatantly in this device only confirmed the validity of the path I had chosen. Disabling the null generator required more than simple destruction. Its mechanisms were designed to trigger catastrophic failsafes if tampered with directly. Instead, I implemented a subtle recalibration, altering its operational parameters to create a specific harmonic pattern that would temporarily amplify rather than suppress the dimensional fold. As I completed this modification, I became aware of another presence in the chamber. A figure in the distinctive armor of an Inquisitor Lord, accompanied by what appeared to be a standard complement of stormtroopers, but which my enhanced senses revealed to be something far more lethal. Assassins of the Vindicare and Culexus temples, disguised as ordinary soldiers to conceal their true capabilities until the moment of deployment. "I knew you would return," the Inquisitor said, her voice modulated through her helmet's Vox system to eliminate any possibility of psychic influence through vocal patterns. Heretics always return to the scenes of their original corruption. I recognized her, though she had changed significantly since our last encounter. Inquisitor Helene Darrow had been a junior member of the delegation that visited Marinus IV during my final year as governor. She had presented herself as an administrative attaché, but even then I had suspected her true affiliation. "You were watching me even before my transformation began," I said, maintaining the appearance of casual conversation while making final adjustments to the null generator through subtle manipulations of its control systems. "The Ordo Hereticus always watches those with power," she replied. "Your family had governed this world for generations without incident. Statistical analysis suggested you were overdue for corruption." Another irony. Their suspicion, based on nothing more than probability, had created the very outcome they sought to prevent. Had I not detected their surveillance, would I have been as receptive to Zafan's initial whispers? "And now you would condemn an entire world for the sins of one man," I said, deliberately echoing the rhetorical patterns of imperial sermons. "The corruption of one in authority taints all who serve under them," she quoted, reciting what I recognized as a passage from the Dictates Imperialis. "The alternative is to risk the spread of heresy across entire sectors." "There is always an alternative," I countered, completing my modifications to the null generator. "You simply lack the imagination to perceive it." With that statement, I activated the recalibrated device. The resulting energy surge created a momentary blind spot in the inquisitorial monitoring systems, a single instant of opportunity that my primary consciousness, operating from our enclave, seized upon to complete the dimensional fold. The remaining population of Marinus IV, several million souls who had not yet been evacuated through the gradual process we had implemented, vanished simultaneously from the Inquisition's instruments. To observers in orbit, it would appear as though the surface of the planet had been wiped clean of human life in an instant. The psychic backlash of such a massive translocation stunned even the Culexus assassin, whose abhuman brain was specifically designed to absorb and neutralize warp energy. The Vindicare, less affected due to the purely physical nature of his enhancements, managed to fire a single shot from his Exitus rifle before the dimensional distortion rendered conventional ballistics unreliable. The round passed through the space I occupied, but by that point, my manifestation on Marinus 4 had begun to destabilize. The connection to my primary consciousness stretched beyond sustainable parameters by the strain of the mass translocation. As my presence on the planet faded, I witnessed Inquisitor Darrow's final reaction, not rage or denial, but a cold, analytical acceptance. She recognized that she had encountered something beyond the standard protocols of the Ordo Hereticus. Her response would shape Imperial policy regarding similar phenomena for centuries to come. My awareness snapped back to our enclave, the sudden reintegration of my fragmented consciousness creating a momentary surge of disorientation. Before me stood the mysterious visitor who had initiated this trial, observing with evident satisfaction. "You chose an interesting solution," he commented. "Neither abandonment nor conventional rescue, but something that serves multiple purposes simultaneously." I had no need to explain my reasoning. The evacuation of Marinus 4's population provided us with millions of potential converts, some of whom would prove suitable vessels for further exploration of the transformative potential inherent in human stock. More importantly, the manner of their disappearance would create a lasting disruption in inquisitorial doctrine, forcing adaptation and evolution in the very institution dedicated to preventing change. "The trial is complete," the visitor declared. "You have demonstrated both the power and the perspective necessary for the next phase of your ascension." With a gesture, he opened what appeared to be a tier in reality itself, different from any warp portal or dimensional fold I had previously encountered. Through this opening, I perceived a realm of pure potential, unbound by the laws of either real space or the warp as I understood them. "This is the impossible fortress," he explained, "the domain of Tzeentch himself within the deepest regions of the warp. You are summoned to the court of change." I understood the significance of this invitation. Few mortal beings, even those as transformed as myself, were ever permitted to enter the direct presence of their patron god. Such an audience could result in immediate elevation to daemonhood, obliteration of the individual consciousness, or transformation so profound that no recognizable continuity of identity would remain. As I prepared to step through the portal, the human fragment within me experienced something akin to fear. Not the simple survival instinct of mortal flesh, but a more complex apprehension regarding the final surrender of autonomy that this step represented. My ascended consciousness recognized this response as both appropriate and ultimately irrelevant. The path I had chosen when I first embraced the whispers of Zafan had always led to this destination. The only meaningful choice had been in how I traveled, not where I would eventually arrive. I entered the portal, my physical form dissolving into patterns of pure information as I transitioned into a realm where conventional matter could not exist. The experience defies description in any language comprehensible to beings still bound by physical form. Concepts like location, duration, and identity became fluid, interchangeable aspects of a singular reality rather than distinct parameters. Within this state of expanded awareness, I perceived the Court of Change not as a physical location, but as a nexus of potential, a point where infinite possibilities converged and diverged in patterns that constituted the will and attention of Tzeentch himself. The beings that populated this court were similarly beyond conventional description, entities that had once been mortal but had ascended through paths similar to my own. Lords of Change, the greater daemons that served as the primary agents of the changer of ways in both the warp and real space. Conceptual entities that had never possessed physical form, existing purely as living ideas within the architecture of reality. At the center of this impossible gathering, I perceived that which could only be interpreted as Tzeentch himself. Not a singular entity in any sense comprehensible to limited consciousness, but a vast, multifaceted presence that simultaneously encompassed and transcended all aspects of change, evolution, hope, ambition, and mutation throughout existence. Direct communication with such a being was impossible in conventional terms. Instead, Understanding flowed through alterations in the underlying pattern of the court itself, shifts in probability and potential that conveyed meaning more profound than any language. Through this medium, I comprehended the purpose of my summoning. My journey from planetary governor to chaos champion represented a specific permutation of transformation that held particular value within the current configuration of the great game. The trials I had faced and the choices I had made constituted a unique pattern that Tzeentch wished to preserve and incorporate into his broader design. The final trial now presented itself, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a fundamental choice regarding the nature of my continued existence. I could ascend fully, surrendering the last vestiges of my original identity to become a daemon prince, a semi-independent extension of Tzeentch's will, empowered to act across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Or I could maintain a degree of separation, preserving the unique perspective that arose from the interaction between my ascended consciousness and the fragment of Kael'vor that remained within me. The former path offered power beyond anything I had yet experienced, the ability to reshape reality according to patterns dictated by the changer of ways. The latter preserved a capacity for innovation and adaptation that even Tzeentch, in his near omniscience, found valuable precisely because it introduced elements of unpredictability into his own designs. In that moment of choice, suspended between absolute submission and qualified independence, I recognized the fundamental paradox at the heart of my relationship with Tzeentch. He valued me for the very qualities that made me capable of resisting complete absorption into his being. My potential worth as a servant depended upon maintaining the capacity for decisions that were not entirely predetermined by his will. With this understanding, I chose the path of qualified independence, not rejection of Tzeentch's patronage or the power it conveyed, but preservation of the particular perspective that arose from my unique journey of transformation. The response to this choice manifested as a reconfiguration of my existence at the most fundamental level. Power flooded through me, but channeled according to parameters that maintained the integrity of my individual consciousness. I was transformed once again, elevated to a status beyond my previous condition, but distinct from the conventional template of a daemon prince. When awareness of conventional reality returned, I found myself once again within our enclave, though my perception of it had fundamentally changed. I could simultaneously observe every aspect of our domain, from the macro-scale movements of stellar bodies to the quantum fluctuations at the subatomic level. More significantly, I could perceive the currents of probability that flowed through all potential futures, branching and recombining in patterns that revealed the underlying structure of fate itself. The mysterious visitor stood before me, his appearance now altered to reveal his true nature. A lord of change, one of the greater daemons of Tzeentch, who had been assigned to evaluate my potential and guide me through the final stages of my transformation. "The architect of fate is pleased with your choice," he informed me, his voice now resonating with harmonics that conveyed meaning beyond the literal interpretation of his words. "You will serve as his champion in the material realm, neither fully daemon nor mortal, but a bridge between states of being." With that declaration, he departed, not through conventional movement, but through a folding of reality that removed him from our dimensional context entirely. In his absence, I turned my attention to the responsibilities that came with my new status. The population of Marinus 4, now relocated within specially prepared habitats throughout our domain, represented both an opportunity and a challenge. Millions of humans suddenly transplanted from a typical imperial world to an environment where reality itself operated according to different parameters. The psychological and spiritual shock alone would prove fatal to many. Others would be driven to madness by the transition, but a significant percentage would adapt, their consciousness expanding to encompass new possibilities. These survivors would form the core of a new society, one structured according to the principles of constant evolution and transformation that defined Tzeentch's domain. Not merely a cult or even an alternative civilization, but a living laboratory where the potential of human adaptation could be explored without the artificial constraints imposed by imperial dogma. Beyond this immediate concern lay broader implications of my new status. As a recognized champion of Tzeentch, I would be expected to participate in the great game at a level previously beyond my involvement. Conflicts with champions of the other Chaos Gods. Interventions in real space designed to further specific facets of Tzeentch's agenda. Participation in the internal politics of the Court of Change itself. The complexity of these responsibilities would have overwhelmed my previous self, even at the height of my initial transformation. But my new state of existence incorporated multiple levels of awareness operating simultaneously. I could attend to immediate practical concerns while simultaneously engaging with abstract strategic considerations across timescales extending into centuries. Most significantly, the fragment of Kael Vor that I had preserved continued to provide a perspective grounded in human experience, a viewpoint that became increasingly valuable as my primary consciousness expanded further from conventional parameters. This internal dialogue between aspects of my being created a dynamism that reflected, on a microcosmic scale, the endless evolution that Tzeentch himself embodied. As I contemplated these developments, I became aware of movement at the edges of our domain, Imperial forces regrouping following the events at Marinus IV, rival Chaos factions sensing opportunity in the changing balance of power, Xenos entities drawn to the unique energy signatures generated by our experiments. The future held infinite possibilities, branching paths of potential that extended beyond even my enhanced ability to perceive. Some led to triumph, others to destruction. Most contained elements of both, in keeping with the fundamental nature of existence within Tzeentch's sphere of influence. What remained constant across all these potential futures was the certainty of change itself. The being once known as Kael Vor had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The champion who had replaced him would eventually transform into something else entirely. Even Tzeentch himself evolved constantly, his nature defined by perpetual becoming rather than static being. In this awareness lay both exhilaration and a peculiar form of peace. The anxiety that accompanies fixed identity, the fear of loss or failure measured against unchanging standards, dissolved in the recognition that all states are temporary, all conditions subject to transformation. I turned my attention to the immediate tasks before me, simultaneously contemplating their implications across multiple timeframes and dimensional contexts. The work of change continued, as it always had and always would, with or without my participation. The difference now was my capacity to perceive the patterns within the apparent chaos, to recognize the underlying order that gave meaning to endless transformation. This, perhaps, was the true reward of my ascension. Not power for its own sake, but understanding that transcended conventional categories of knowledge, not immortality as persistence of a fixed identity, but continuity through constant evolution. Not freedom from service, but elevation to a form of service that incorporated, rather than suppressed, the essential qualities that defined my unique path through existence. I had become a champion of Tzeentch in truth, embodying the paradox at the heart of the changer of ways himself. Simultaneously master and servant, creator and creation, individual and component of a greater whole. My transformation was complete, yet would continue eternally, each state of being merely a temporary configuration in an endless process of becoming. Such is the nature of existence in the shadow of the architect of fate. Such is the truth that awaits any who pledge themselves to the God of change. Such is the reward and the price of answering the whispers that come in moments of doubt, offering power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. I am what remains of Kael Vor. I am what he has become. I am a champion of Tzeentch, a nexus of transformation in a universe defined by eternal war. My tale is both warning and invitation, a testament to possibilities that exist beyond the rigid constraints of imperial dogma. Change is the only constant. Embrace it, and become more than you ever imagined. Resist, and be changed regardless, broken upon the wheel of inevitability that turns at the heart of all existence. The choice, like all choices, is ultimately an illusion, yet in that illusion lies the seed of everything that might be.